Do you ever look at the world and wish that you could make it a better place? There's much in the world that is not good. There are people who are broken and who struggle. Governments pass laws that are unjust. There is plenty of criminal activity ranging on a spectrum from vandalism through to robbery, through to much worse. There are churches in this country who wake up one morning and discover that planning permission has just been granted for an enormous mosque to be built just the other side of the street from where they meet. One church that I was a part of many years ago had discovered one day that there was a planning application for a large lap dancing club just a few streets away. And they were distraught and fought to try to prevent this from happening. How can we fight the things that are not good? How can we transform our society to make it a better place? Now, if you're here this morning as a Christian, you know something really important that I need to remind us of, and that if you're here still looking into the Christian faith, this is really important that you understand that this is what the Christian faith teaches, and that is that the problem with the world starts in our own hearts. Christians, we're not people who are basically sorted, basically good, basically healthy, who then look down our noses at the rest of the world and just go, I wish the rest of the world could be as sorted as I am. That is not what Christianity is all about. Jesus taught really, really clearly that the reason the world is broken is because we are broken. And a Christian is somebody that God has reached down into their life to forgive them. He's given us new hearts that we don't deserve. He's made us new people, and then gradually, little by little, he transforms us to become the people that he wants us to be. But we're not content just to have God make us into better people gradually. We want to see the world become better as well. We want others to know what we have received as kindness from our God, and today we are going to think about how that can happen. Last time, if you were with us, we looked at the first half of Acts chapter 19 together, and we saw that the Apostle Paul spent nearly 3 years in the city of Ephesus. And today we have events that occurred right at the end of his time in that city. These were the events that led Paul finally to move on from Ephesus and on to the next stages of his life. And as we look at these verses together, we're going to see 3 things about how the gospel and the culture of the world around us interact with each other. So here's number one. Number one, the gospel transforms whole cities. The gospel transforms whole cities. Here's what happened. Luke tells the story really well. Augustina read it really clearly, so you hardly need me to tell you the story. But let me just draw a few details out. The silversmiths in Ephesus had a really good trade going. And along with their related craftsmen in related trades, they all came together one day, led by a guy called Demetrius. Demetrius, perhaps he was the guild leader in Ephesus for all these trades, and he acts as their spokesman. He points out to the craftsmen that they have it good. They have a good income. It's a profitable business. They've been making silver models to sell to tourists. Ephesus was a major travel center, and all the roads converged, even the coastline, and people would travel through, and they made a huge income, selling little silver trinkets to the people who passed through Ephesus. We don't quite know what these things were. Perhaps they were little models of the temple of Artemis. The temple of Artemis in Ephesus has been excavated. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. on a scale of the sort of pyramids of Giza. It was roughly the size of 2 modern-day rugby pitches placed next to each other, held up by, now I forget the number, I think 127 stone columns, 60 feet high. When you think this was an ancient world without cranes and steel and all, it's extraordinary building that just your jaw dropped when you saw it. So maybe they made little silver models of the temple, or maybe models of Artemis. So we read later, don't we, in the chapter, that her image fell down from heaven. Now, what people think that was probably a meteor. A bit of space junk had landed in Ephesus, only it looked a bit like a person. So sophisticated people that they were, they concluded that this now tells them at last what their goddess looks like, so they could now, in an informed way, make statues of her, including miniatures that could be sold for profit. They had a good thing going, these silversmiths. On the other hand, though, they had the Apostle Paul. And the Apostle Paul had been preaching for 3 years that gods that you have made by human hands with a chisel and various mechanical tools are not actually gods. And their income was taking a hit. They were noticeably losing trade because people were no longer worshipping Artemis. Instead, they were worshipping Jesus Christ, and so they were stopping buying the pieces of silver. Now, Demetrius was a shrewd worker. He knew how to play people, and he knew that filing his company's annual report at the end of the year with a little paragraph buried near the bottom from the auditors, raising question marks about the going concern status of the company, would not exactly help solve the problem. He needed to be a little bit more canny than that to get the city to be sympathetic. So he moved on from arguing that their profits had been denting to stressing that Artemis herself was in danger of suffering. She could lose her worldwide reputation, and so could the temple. Now, at this point, the people are beginning to become on his side, and they're sensing that this is a problem that must be solved. Note the 3 references in this chapter to the whole province of Asia. So in verse 27, we hear that there is a danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited. The goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty. There's Artemis. She's worshipped throughout the province of Asia. But then there's verse 10, last week's reading, where Paul was in Ephesus in the lecture hall of Tyrannus for 2 years, so that all the Jews and Greeks who lived in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord. So there's the competition, you see. Artemis is worshipped throughout the province of Asia, but now everyone in the province of Asia has heard the word of the Lord. By the way, this is the Roman province of Asia, roughly modern Turkey, not the continent of Asia. And then verse 26 is the third reference. You see that Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia. So in this battleground for Asia, Paul is winning and Artemis is losing. And so there is uproar. The craftsmen cry out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." There's a lovely little touch in this passage. In verse 25, he stresses that we receive a good income, no small income. And therefore, Luke says in verse 23, there was a great disturbance. There was no small disturbance in the city because what they lost was no small income. What this shows is that the length of time that Paul was in Ephesus, preaching every day, meant that people across the province were becoming Christians, and in such vast numbers that the silversmiths noticed. Enough people were becoming Christians to impact which trades were making money and which trades were losing money. This passage invites us to have a big vision for our evangelism. We long to see people become Christians. At least I hope you do. I do. But this passage wants us to set our horizons bigger than your friends and family and neighbours becoming Christians. It is much, much bigger than that. Yes, we want to see God transform other people's lives, in the way that he's transforming ours. But we also want to see God transform Scarborough. We want to see God transform the school that you go to. We want to see God transform the company that you work at. We want to see God transform the housing development on which you live. We want to see God transform the business section of Scarborough on South Bay around the Old Town. We want the way that people spend their time in the leisure parts of the town to be changed and we want Scarborough to become a different place. That is the vision. We want to see God transform North Yorkshire and South Yorkshire and Sheffield and West Yorkshire as well. We want to see God transform the United Kingdom. We want to see God transform the world. Now, what you do stays the same. What you do to see that happen is this. You share the good news with your friends. You join Shaheen and others in the church to knock on some doors in the area around this building and invite them to come and discover what it is that we do here on a Sunday and the God that we know. We as a church run events at which people can come and hear about Jesus. It's the same old stuff that we've been doing. But what's changed, what's fresh here, is the vision to get behind as we do that. This is a vision that should excite us. It is bigger. Our horizons are wider than we have perhaps been used to. So what do you do if this church discovers one day that a 5,000 seating capacity mosque is to be built the other side of Dean Road? What do we do? What do you do if your church hears that a large, modern, new lap dancing club is about to open a couple of 100 yards away? What do you do if the government of our nation were to pass legislation that says it is okay for doctors to kill the elderly to prevent them becoming a drain on the health service? What do you do? Do you fight it? Yes, you bet you do. We need good laws that protect human beings and especially protect the vulnerable, which means the very young, the very old, and the very sick, and the weak. But that fighting is only part of the answer. The most important part of the answer is that we preach the good news of Jesus Christ. We work and we pray to see people become Christians, to become Christians in such numbers that these things that we want to see no longer a part of our town are going out of business because no one wants to go to them anymore. Now, this is the long-term answer, not a quick fix, but that is what we do. So that rather than screaming that things should not be allowed that will get people hurt, we work for a day when those things that see people hurt cannot survive because too much of the town is Christian. That's bigger than just thinking, well, wouldn't it be nice if there were another 30 of our friends in here to make us a bit bigger? It's transforming whole cities, whole regions, whole cultures as the gospel takes root. The gospel transforms whole cities. Number two, whole cities hate the gospel. Whole cities hate the gospel. So here's what happened next. Demetrius and the others had a grievance, and they spill out onto the streets, and the crowd gradually grows and funnels into the theatre. Now, don't think Stephen Joseph Theatre. Think Roman amphitheatre. It's dug into a hillside on the edge of Ephesus. It's been very well excavated. It's survived very well. Modern estimates are the seating capacity would have been 25,000, something like that, a bit bigger than Hall A at the street. Imagine that full. Wembley Stadium, full of a crowd. Now, at this point, the non-Christian Jews are getting a little jittery. Why? They also only believe that there is one God and that Artemis is not real. And they're thinking, they know we think that too, and we are about to be accused of being part of all of this. That would not be good. Let's try and distance ourselves from Paul. So this guy Alexander gets sort of shoved up the front. Tell him this, tell him it's not us, it's just Paul. But as soon as they realise who he is, the poor guy can't get a word in, and you get 2 hours of chanting. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And it will not stop. It's almost like if you've seen newsreel footage of some of these kind of totalitarian companies when people feel intimidated by fear to support their undemocratically appointed leader, that they kind of these huge rallies just chanting in support of their supreme leader of the country. Only it isn't that. The people want to be there. They are proud to be Ephesians, proud of Artemis. This is from their hearts, chanting in loyalty to Artemis, and they will not shut up until the city clerk eventually quietens them down. This was utter confusion. This is mob rule. This is red-blooded chaos. Luke even says most of them didn't know why they were there. They just followed the crowd through the streets, sensing that there was good entertainment, a fight to be had, and thought, well, let's go and see what's going on, lads, shall we? Oh, let's join in the shouting. They had no idea what was going on. They were just caught up in it. See, when the gospel starts to bite, people will feel the cost. And when the gospel starts to affect your income, you feel it. When the gospel starts to affect your gods, the things you worship, the things you hold most dear in life, you feel it. When you become a Christian, you know, I think, this pressure. Many of you have reached the point when in your Christian growth, when you suddenly realize that the Lord Jesus is interested in your priorities. He's interested in your money. He's interested in how you spend it and how you earn it. You suddenly realize that you might be earning less going forwards because of some choices that you're going to be making. And there's that little moment for many Christians when you suddenly go, oh, did I actually sign up to this? Do I really want this? Or is this going to be too costly and I'm just going to quietly back away? Now, in Ephesus, the problem was this. Lots of people were persuaded and followed Jesus. We've learnt that. Enough people to transform the whole city, but not everybody. And here's the snag. There were people who were not persuaded, who knew what Paul had taught about Jesus. They knew, but they did not want to follow him. But they were being asked to pay the cost as well. They were not on board with Jesus, but it was even though they had said no to Jesus, it was costing them that other people were saying yes. Their incomes were affected. The more the gospel bites, the more the gospel transforms you, the more the gospel transforms this town, the more other people around will start to notice it and will start to resent it. And that's true if the gospel starts to transform your school, your workplace, your neighborhood. People will notice and not everybody will be pleased. Some of us here live in households within which not everybody is a Christian. And you already know, without me telling you, how easily others in your house resent what you do because you are. So at this point, let me say something really important to you. Don't get me wrong. Part of what Jesus wants you to do is to be a good husband, a good wife, a good son, a good daughter, a good parent, a good brother, a good sister, and so on. Do not ever use your loyalty to Jesus as an excuse to neglect those people that God has asked you to care for. But if you follow through and are consistently loyal to Jesus, no matter how much you try to be a loving and kind and godly person as you relate to those around you, there will come points at which the transformation in your life becomes resented by others. It is unavoidable. And for you, I'm afraid, it is literally closer to home than for others of us. But let's be under no illusion. If God continues to bless the ministry of this church, then the character of the town within which we live will be transformed. And it will be noticed. And not everyone will like it. And we will increasingly find ourselves on the receiving end of opposition and even hatred. We want the gospel to spread. We want it to transform us. We want it to transform the area within which we live. But the more it happens, the more opposition we'll get. And Luke is saying to us, be prepared that that is what will happen. Now, let's just notice the way that the people of Ephesus express their hatred. Let's talk for a moment about Artemis. Now, maybe you're an expert on the Greek legends or whatever. I'd love you to teach me more about Artemis later, because I'm not. Artemis was the Greek name for the one the Romans called Diana, and she's a slightly complicated goddess. In the Greek mythology, she was the daughter of Zeus, twin sister of Apollo. But here's the slightly funny thing. The goddess of the Greek legends seems to be slightly different in character from the goddess in the province of Asia, the more local area where her worship focused. She seemed to have some slightly different traits. So it's a little bit tricky to kind of work out exactly what she stood for. But here seems to be the consensus. She seems to be the goddess, in particular, of two things: hunting, and with that, care for and husbandry of wild animals and nature, but also the goddess of childbirth. Bizarrely, she was a virgin and yet had apparently experienced childbirth. So there's this kind of sort of paradox in the Artemis story. But as you put that whole thing together, the picture you get is that she stood for nature and for animal instinct. And this was reflected in the way she was worshipped and the practices that took place at her temple and elsewhere. So as this mob converges with such an anger and a rage that if they had got hold of the Apostle Paul, they would literally have ripped him limb from limb, they look like, resemble a pack of dogs or a pack of wolves. Well, that is not an accident, because that is the kind of goddess Artemis that was the kind of way that you would defend her. So when the unbelieving world feels threatened, they will oppose the Christian church. But do not expect them to do so with Christian character. Do not expect, when we face opposition for the things we believe and talk of, do not expect that opposition to come to us with truthfulness, honesty, integrity, patience, gentleness, and kindness. These are the characteristics, the personality traits that come from knowing the Lord Jesus Christ, who is those things in himself. Expect instead the opposition to come in ways that reflect the values of the gods that others worship. Now, at times, we too will want to defend our faith. We will want to fight back, hold our own. We will want to defend the God that we believe in. And as we do that, we need to be really careful that we don't copy the world around us in the way that we do it. We defend our faith in ways that reflect God's character, with an integrity, with a kindness, with a gentleness that is not shown by those who oppose us. It's very easy, if a hard ball comes at you, to return it in the same spirit, but we mustn't do that. And as we work through the next chapters of Acts, we will see lots of ways in which Paul defends the faith. And it's markedly very different, and I believe Luke is setting up a deliberate contrast to the kinds of ways that he is opposed and treated. One last little comment on this. Luke wants us to see this riot as an act of worship. This is more of the same point, really, of the character of what's going on. This is what happens when you worship a different God. Just think for a moment about the word church. The word church. That's what we're doing this morning. We are a church. The church just means an assembly or a gathering. That's what the word literally means. And it's acquired this kind of specialist religious use, that this is what it means when Christians gather together to worship their God. The gathering of Christians on a Sunday morning is church, capital C. But actually, the word assembly, well, we use it in other ways, and so did they. It can mean the local parliament. It did back then, and actually even today, we talk, do we not, in devolved government of the Welsh Assembly, the parliament in Wales that decides on matters devolved to the Welsh. But and we get that use in this passage here, verse 39. If there's anything further you want to bring up, it must be settled in a legal assembly, ecclesia. But we also get the word for church in two other verses in this passage. Verse 32, the assembly was in confusion. And verse 41, after he had said this, he dismissed the assembly. The riot is literally a church. But it's a very different kind of church because it's a very different kind of God driving that church. So whenever we gather to worship God, to eat together, as we will do next week, to defend our faith, whatever it is, let's make sure that people looking in see the character of the God that we worship and not the character of the little gods that others worship. Whole towns hate the gospel. Number 3, this is a really brief point just before we close, is that hatred helps the gospel to reach cities. Hatred, we've just thought about, helps the gospel to reach cities. So as a final little brief point. So end of last week's reading, verse 21, says the time has come for Paul to leave Ephesus. He resolves to go to Jerusalem, from there to Rome, and we know from elsewhere in the New Testament his next ambition from Rome was to plant a brand new church in Spain. That's where he's going next. Verse 22 says, but he didn't go immediately. He sent Timothy and Erastus on ahead, but he stayed in the province of Asia a little longer. That's the end of last week. Beginning of next passage, chapter 20, verse 1, when the uproar had ended, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, said goodbye and set out for Macedonia. What finally got him to move on? The uproar, the riot, the hatred was his cue that now it really is time to move. We see this regularly in the book of Acts. When people oppose the gospel, that is the catalyst that sees the gospel spread. You get it with Stephen, the first Christian martyr, the first person to be killed for their faith in Jesus. What happened after Stephen was killed? The church, the Christians, were scattered from Jerusalem, Luke says, and they preached the good news wherever they went. And we will see lots of examples of this in the coming chapters of Acts as well. It happened in China. In 1954, the recently appointed communist government expelled all Western missionaries from China. And everyone in the West, rather arrogantly, saw this happening and thought, oh no, a new government that hates Christians, and they've sent all of us out to look at who we're looking after them. This will kill the church in China. 30 years later, the doors opened and we were all allowed back in. And what did we discover had happened in the pressure cooker that was communist China? Explosive Christian growth. Now, I think I'm correct in saying this. Someone tell me later if I've got it wrong. I think it's right. The country in the world today in which the church is growing faster than in any other country is Iran, in which Christians are singularly hated and persecuted. This is the consistent pattern. This riot, this chaos, this uproar is what moves Paul out of Ephesus and onto his next phase. It's so easy to be discouraged by opposition. But we've seen it's inevitable that gospel growth leads to opposition. But here's the truth. That opposition is what actually drives the gospel out. God holds in his hand the kings and queens of this world. The wise ones recognize it. God holds in his hand nations. God holds in his hand courts, local councils, planning authorities. God holds them in his hand. And what looks to us like something trying to stop the gospel is actually all part of his plan. It's part of what God is doing to see fresh growth in his kingdom. So I want to set an exciting vision before you this morning. I'd love us to keep sharing our faith with those around us, but I want us to catch Luke's vision. As we reach out, yes, it's wonderful to give a few individuals salvation for eternity. Let's not play that down. That is an amazing gift to give somebody. Salvation, eternity in heaven, not hell. That is a wonderful thing to give them. But we are doing something much bigger than that. We are part of God's project to transform Scarborough, to transform Yorkshire, to transform the UK, to transform the world with the gospel of Jesus Christ. As people become Christians, it transforms whole cultures. But this comes at a cost to us, and at a cost to others for which we will be blamed. But it's God's project. And even when it's costly, the very price we pay is part of the wonderful God's plan to take this good news onwards, outwards, to the ends of the earth.